You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Refreshing wild cherry cola meets smooth cream. The treat you deserve. Pepsi Wild Cherry and Cream. Treat yourself.
This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
This episode is brought to you by our Patreon members. Thank you so much.
Join our Patreon for extra episodes, interviews, extra content, and to help support the podcast and help us continue to do the work we do.
Go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl to learn more.
A curse was on us, brother. Thy bane have I wrought thee.
I'm Jenny Williamson.
And I'm Jen McMenemy.
And this is Ancient History Fangirl. So, when Theodoric the Great died in 526 AD, many myths sprang up around that death. Some say he died of crippling guilt after seeing a dead fish that looked like the severed head of a man he'd had executed. Others whispered that he was thrown into a volcano or hauled off to hell on the back of a demonic horse. Others say it was dysentery.
I do not abide by dysentery. What a boring way to go.
I mean, I really think that the dysentery is the worst way to go out of all of these.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that is probably the worst way to go out of all of these. But, like, you hear, like, thrown into a volcano, carried off by seahorses. Like, I don't know. Crippling guilt over executing someone he shouldn't have executed because he saw, like, a creepy fish head. I'm like, yes, give me the drama. And then it's like dysentery. A lot of people died of dysentery. It's not a great way to go.
I know. I also played the Oregon Trail game.
Oh, yeah, I never made it far.
Anyway, after his death, he was buried in a vast mausoleum, thank you, in Ravenna, with a bathtub for a coffin. This is true. He was buried in a bathtub. It was a very elaborate porphyry bathtub, like that purple marble from a Roman bath complex. It was like very expensive marble. After he died, those stories about him didn't stop. His spirit lived on in Germanic heroic legend. It turns out that long after the smoke from the battlefields died down, long after the ravens had eaten their fill, the whole migration era lived on in Germanic heroic legend well into the Middle Ages and even beyond. For centuries after the battles and events of that era, people throughout Europe were crafting legends and sagas that repurposed and mythologized those events, sometimes recasting major figures from the time into villains and heroes of a later era. Goths and Huns figured prominently, and that is our subject today. What got mythologized, and who, and how?
Hot. I'm a sucker for mythology.
I thought you would like this. So Jen, what is Germanic heroic legend? How do we define that?
Well, Jenny, you've written me a definition, so I can help. It is the heroic literary tradition of Germanic-speaking peoples set within a mythologized version of the migration era, the 400s to the 600s AD, or roughly thereabouts. These were mostly oral folk legends and histories that spread far and wide as the upheaval of the migration era ground on, as kingdoms rose and fell, and stories of great men and their great deeds on the battlefield ignited the imagination of a traumatized populace. The belief is that people heard about battlefield events of the migration era from far away. Theodoric's wars with the Squinter, the Battle of Chalon, the three Amalai brothers' success in liberating their people from the Huns, and transformed these events into epic songs and poetry. Those tales then transformed with the centuries until they were written down by monks in the medieval era. By then, a lot was unrecognizable, but not all of it.
Germanic heroic legend can be found in many forms, from short poems that focus in on a single episode in a hero's life, to great sweeping heroic sagas and epics that tell the stories of multiple generations. Some of the Viking and Icelandic sagas fall into this category. Beowulf falls into this category. So, arguably, does Wagner's Ring cycle and even The Lord of the Rings. This storytelling tradition swept across the Germanic-speaking world. From Germany and Austria to Scandinavia to England and Iceland, These legends have been found among Anglo-Saxon pirates, Icelandic and Nordic Vikings, all over the British Isles, and in many other places. The most common type of verse was alliterative verse, which makes some historians believe these pieces were meant to be sung. Depending on where and when you were, there may have been a class of minstrels called scops in some places that specialized in singing these tales.
So, Jenny, what are the characteristics of Germanic legend?
I bet you're going to tell me.
I am, because you wrote it, so you have a little bit of insight, foresight, all the sight. Germanic heroic legend is a little hard to define, but historians have picked out some sort of defining features. First, the setting is the migration period, usually, as we've mentioned, a very mythologized version that constitutes a quote-unquote heroic age. Real figures from the migration era will be featured, but not accurately. In fact, it's common for people who never met in real life to interact in these settings. The hero is the central figure of Germanic legend. And again, this could be said for pretty much any genre of story, but to give you a sense of this type of hero, we're telling you to look back at Jordanes and his concern with great men who did great deeds. Even in his time, 551 AD, he highlighted these great men in his attempt to give a heroic gloss to the Amale family line, with a focus on names that must have loomed large even in his time: Ostrogotha, Ermanaric, Valamir, Vidimir, and Theodomir, and many others.
Heroes in Germanic legend are usually men, sometimes women, and almost always warriors, defined by their great deeds. They are special people, not necessarily superhuman, but with abilities well beyond their fellow mortals. Usually, these are fighting abilities, but moral virtue comes into it as well. Heroic moral virtues include glory, honor, and loyalty, all traits that go all the way back to Tacitus, who said those were especially valued among Germanic tribes.
Not all scholars agree with this definition. Some argue that the Germanic hero tends to also be egotistical and unnecessarily violent, and argue that a better definition of a Germanic hero is he is outsized in everything he does, whether positive or negative. Some have tried to draw a line between a heroic death and a tragic death. Other character flaws include a preoccupation with fame and status, as these heroes are almost uniformly members of the aristocracy. However, Germanic heroes were often also motivated by a sense of honor and duty to their people. And while Germanic heroes were indeed exceptional warriors, they tended not to be superhuman demigods. They tend to be a lot closer to humans. There are, of course, some exceptions.
Yeah, there's exceptions to everything, and there are a lot of different ancient stories and sagas that are categorized this way, and I'm sure every broad generalization we just made here, there's exceptions to it. And I feel like the perfect example of a Germanic hero, I was trying to explain this to Jen a while ago, and I was trying to think of what we would both know really well that would comply with what I just described, and that is the heroes in Tolkien. The Lord of the Rings is just steeped in Germanic legendary tropes. We have a broken sword that was forged anew, a horse people based on the Goths, that would be the Rohirrim, the concept of Middle Earth, different races of beings, men, elves, dwarves, and so on. An aristocratic hero motivated by a sense of duty, that would be Aragorn. It's got everything, even a martial woman, Éowyn, who I actually was looking through a few of these older Germanic legends, and I found like a proto-Éowyn that I want to tell Jen about, and I will in a Patreon. I would say that everybody basically has Germanic hero qualities in Tolkien, but probably the most typey one, like the best example of this, is Aragorn. He's kind of like, the perfect Germanic hero. We have an extraordinary warrior who is nevertheless not a demigod. He's motivated primarily by a sense of duty. He has a named sword that was broken and forged again. So many of the tropes that appear in Lord of the Rings come directly from Germanic sagas. Oh, and he's secretly a king, so he's nobility.
The thing about Aragorn is that he doesn't have some of the things that I think are probably more uniquely like Germanic heroes. Like, he's not a braggart, he's not egotistical, he's not doing anything for the glory of his name. He's much more self-sacrificing, and like the critical reading here is there's a lot of Christ-like stuff in there, including the fact that he can like heal people who are like almost mortally wounded.
I mean, but that isn't untrue because Tolkien had that lens. There are Germanic hero types that are self-sacrificing, like the honor and duty is also a real trope there, and there are variations in characters, like some of them are like assholes and braggarts and stuff, but like some of them aren't. And also like the king healing stuff, like that showed up in a lot of kingly myths. Like real life kings were said to have healing powers sometimes, weren't they?
There is, in many different cultures across the world, this divine right to rule wherein, like, your line is descended. Like, think of the Ptolemies, Cleopatra. Like, they all were, like, you know, descended from gods according to their myth making, right? So I had to add that because I can't unsee it. And knowing how Christian Tolkien was, like, I feel like it would be doing a disservice to not admit it. But as Jenny said, there are so many myths that also do the same thing.
Well, I don't think it was only Christian kings, though.
Absolutely. I totally agree. But I think, like, you can't take that out.
I just think it's a yes and.
So let's also add up another thing about these characters, right? Tolkien's characters are sexless.
That's true, right? Like, do you agree with that? I think so. It's just not a horny book.
There's nothing horny. Like, no one fucks anyone. Like, the fact that anyone like reproduces in Tolkien's world is like, I guess it's all got to be asexual. Like, the only things that matter are male friendships and your duty.
Yeah, it feels very asexual. And like relationships between men and women feel very duty bound.
Yeah, they feel very duty bound. I mean, I feel like there's a great queer reading of Tolkien that one day, if I ever have time, I really want to do. Because the only people who have any sort of like meaningful relationships are between characters who are male or when they're coded male, like when Éowyn is Durnhelm, when she's a boy, essentially. Like, that is when they come alive and they get to be people with desires. And I'm not saying there's a sexuality there or that anything, but I do think there is something there in those relationships, how strong they are, how they care about each other. I'm sorry, Frodo and Sam belong together forever.
No, I think that there's a lot of subverted queerness. There's a lot of queer codedness, and potentially you could argue queer platonic friendships in Tolkien. You could argue that that is subverted queerness and that there are sexual things going on under the surface. I don't know if there's like a really big reading out there that suggests Tolkien was gay. I have no idea.
I mean, he had a lot of children and, you know, he had a wife. I don't have an answer and I don't know that he did it consciously. And I don't want to suggest that because I think we also put our own lenses on things.
We absolutely do. And I think to me, what that speaks to, like the intensely queer platonic friendships in Tolkien remind me, and I could be way off, you know, this is just my read. I know a lot of people have different opinions on this, but my opinion is that it has more to do with Tolkien's experience during the war and like the intense relationships with other men that he experienced in the war. Going home and like marrying a woman, like all of that, like you have, those are also intense relationships, but that just feels like less intense and alive than the wartime experience he had with his brothers in arms. That's just the feel I get.
That is the appropriate reading. That is absolutely what it is. It has to do with his wartime experiences. It has to do with, like, sort of, as Jenny said, when you return home, when you leave sort of this place where in every single moment feels incredibly precious and precarious and makes you feel alive in a way that doesn't exist when you return back to your home life. There's a friendship and a companionship with your brothers in arms or sisters.
Yeah, but compare this to other types of legends, right? Compare this to Greek mythology. Compare this to Cuchulainn in Irish mythology. Like, these are cycles of myths that are very queer and very bisexual and very slutty. You know, like you have a hero like Cuchulainn who sleeps with men and women on the page. Like, it's very overt, you know? And you have, obviously, everybody in Greek mythology is fucking everybody else, no matter what gender they are. Like, that is what is happening. Like, they're just so horny compared to this type of mythology.
Or what animal they are during the fucking, you know?
Yeah, and one thing to point out here is that this is different than, for example, things like Norse mythology with Loki and Odin and Freya. Some of that mythology is very horny and kind of gender bendy in places, and I'm sure there's a lot of other examples like that too, but it's not, at least as far as we know, based on stories of the migration era. There are some counterpoints, like you could definitely argue that Norse mythology, for example, may have had a similar mythic ancestor to Gothic mythology from way back that was shared by the Goths prior to their leaving their proto-homeland of Skanza. I mean, there's a lot to debate in that assumption. Additional counterpoint is that longer works, like for example, the Prose Edda, contains some stories that fall into this category, even if the whole work doesn't come from the migration era Goths, but some parts of it do. You know, the boundaries are fuzzy here, the definitions are a little fuzzy. This is stuff that historians and folklorists debate even now, so it is a little complicated for me to define as a layperson, but I am doing my best here.
In the Mabagonian, too, right? Like, there's all kinds of people fucking each other of the same sex, different, like, animals and, all kinds of stuff. I'm thinking of like Ariane Rod.
That had a real foot fetish in it somewhere.
Mm-hmm. It seems a little bit like some of these Germanic legends we're going to talk about are kind of sexless in comparison to that. And Lord of the Rings in comparison to those stories. Achilles is burning the world down over his rage at losing Patroclus, who is, according to some people, just his roommate, right?
I have not read all Germanic legends, so there might be some slutty ones that I'm unaware of. People do get married and have kids in these stories, kind of like people get married and have kids in Tolkien. And people do battle over trying to get this woman or that woman. Like, that definitely happens. It's just not, it's not horny, Like, we don't have all this wild bisexuality and, like, craziness that you have in other myth cycles we see.
Listen, let's be honest. If Lord of the Rings was being written by, like, an Irish, Cuchulainn type saga, Frodo and Sam would be fucking furiously on the way to Mount Doom. They would be. Because that's what we see with Ferdiad and Cuchulainn, right? They're like battling each other at the ford, tending to each other's wounds, and then, fucking at night. But we don't see that in Tolkien, and I don't think we see that as much in Germanic legends, and that's okay. It's just a different way to tell a story. It's just an interesting absence. And, Frodo and Sam are a great example of a platonic friendship that means the world to both of them, but it is just a friendship. They were just roommates.
Like Bert and Ernie are just roommates.
Listen, I'm not going to start a fight with Tolkien people over this.
No, we're both Tolkien people ourselves. Everybody has different opinions, You don't need to start a war over this on social. These are just our opinions. So like I said, people do get married in Germanic legend. And what you do see is a lot of heroes fighting for the hand of a king's daughter or something like that. And then they get married again. I'm sure there are exceptions to this. I just have not read any slutty ones. If somebody knows some, point me in that direction.
Because what you see with Cuchulainn is he does all the stuff to fight for the hand of Emer.
But then he's having sex with other people, men and women.
He's also just fucking around the whole time, and she's just waiting for him to come home. And again, that legend is heavily influenced in different places by Christians telling that story, but I do love that it's just so weird and slutty. Like, he's like, I'm here to get the hand of this woman who I love, but also I love everyone.
The thing about it is that, you have like a Hercules or a Achilles or a Cuchulainn, like these types of heroes. They were also preserved and written down by monks. So they did get that lens. I think the difference with the Germanic legends is that they were already Christian when they originated, because they were being told in this Germanic environment where they were Christians from a very, very early time. So that's kind of what makes me think that these were not just pagan stories with a Christian lens. They are originally Christian stories or, Christian coded stories in some way. That's my thought. Like, I'm not sure when the Lombards converted, but they were probably also Christian by the time they came into Italy. And there is a theory that the Lombards originated much of this stuff. Anyway, so Tolkien it's documented, he was drawing from a lot of ancient Germanic mythology that spread throughout so much of Europe and Britain.
But Tolkien's not the only person who tapped into the power of these myths, because the Nazis also appropriated and bastardized versions of this mythology for their own nationalist myth-making. So Tolkien and Hitler were drawing from the same source material. Which is dark. Here's the thing. The Nazis appropriated and bastardized this mythology, this Germanic mythology, to build their own sense of Aryan, with a Y, not an I. We talked about the Aryan Christians who are different. They used this to build their Aryan mythology that's centered on white Germans. So, with that in mind, and bearing in mind that these myths that we're going to tell you about are ancient. So whatever modern context you have, like Jenny said, other people have co-opted them, but that's not the case with the original origins of the stories. So let's talk about some of the early characterizations of these myths and what the connection is to the real history that the myths are based on.
Raise the rudders! Raise the sails! Raise the sails!
Captain, an unidentified ship is approaching. Over.
Roger. Wait, is that an Enterprise sales solution?
Reach sales professionals, not professional sailors. With LinkedIn ads, you can target the right people by industry, job title, and more. Start converting your B2B audience today. Spend $250 on your first campaign and get a free $250 credit for the next one. Get started today at linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Cologuard. Do you know what's really scary? Not screening for colon cancer when you turn 45. The Cologuard test is non-invasive, requires no special prep or time off work, and ships right to your door. In just 3 simple steps, Cologuard takes the scare out of colon cancer screening. If you're 45 or older and at average risk, ask your healthcare provider about the Cologuard test. Cologuard is available by prescription only. Learn more or request a prescription today at Cologuard.com/screen.
Kraft Mac and Cheese is better than 90s hip-hop. We'll remind you of your childhood without making you feel incredibly old. Kraft Mac and Cheese. Best thing ever.
Yeah, so one of the earliest figures from Gothic history who we find in these stories is Ermanaric. And Ermanaric, just to remind you, he's appeared quite a bit in the episodes that we've done, but he was a Grithungi king in the 370s AD during the Gothic refugee crisis of 376. When the Huns came down from the northeast, we are not completely sure, his people and a huge crowd of others were driven to the shores of the Danube to petition for shelter from the Roman Empire. Valens, the Roman emperor at the time, led the Tervingian, but not the Grithungi. We all remember this story. Some of the Grithungi crossed the Danube later, but Ermanaric stayed on the north side with his people, and together they waited for the Huns to roll over them like a terrible tide. Even in Ammianus Marcellinus, our earliest source on him, we see Ermanaric being painted as one of these traditional Germanic heroes. He shares a lot of those qualities. Quote, "The Huns made the more boldly a sudden inroad into the extensive and rich cantons of Ermanaric, a most warlike monarch, dreaded by the neighboring nations because of his many and varied deeds of valor." That's very Germanic hero. Great men who did great deeds, that's what this is. He was struck with consternation at the violence of this sudden storm. For a long time, he did his best to maintain a firm and continued stand, but since rumor gave wide currency to and exaggerated the horror of the impending dangers, he put an end to his fear of these great perils by a voluntary death. So that is the Ammianus Marcellinus version of Ermanaric's death, in which he takes his own life because of the terror of the approaching Huns. And we've talked about what this death means, how it might have been a noble sacrifice to the gods, something like that. We're not sure.
The many and varied deeds of valor set him up as one of those traditional heroes from the first. Like Jenny said, maybe he was a sacrificial king. He had to die so his people could live and not be rolled over by the Huns. We don't know. Germanic heroes are great men who did great deeds, and they have a strong sense of duty. Even Ermanaric's death may have been an act of sacrifice to the gods, so a heroic or tragic death depending on the interpretation. Ammianus Marcellinus is our earliest source on Ermanaric, and he lived during the late 300s, so at around the same time these events were happening. In an earlier episode, we told you about Ermanaric's death in Ammianus Marcellinus, how he took his own life out of despair due to the terrible rumors of the Huns. But we also mentioned another version, and that's the version that Jenny is going to tell you about. Take it away, Jenny.
Yeah, so this one's in Jordanes, and it's a little bit more batshit. Jordanes tells us that sometime before the Huns came, Ermanaric, angry at the treachery of a tribe called the Mrasimoni, ordered a woman of that tribe, Sunilda, to be torn apart by horses, quote, by driving them at full speed in opposite directions. So I think she's like dismembered by horses. Her 2 brothers, Sarus and Immius, sought revenge by stabbing Ermanaric in the side. This didn't kill Ermanaric, but it drastically weakened and wounded him, which is why he took his own life in the face of Hunnic invasion. Also in this story, he was over 100 years old at this point, so there's that too. You can already see the myth-making at work here, built around another name that must have loomed large in Gothic oral history by now, Sarus. The original Sarus was an enemy of Alaric, my Alaric, and his henchmen betrayed and murdered Alaric's right-hand man, Ataulf, in the bath. In this story, the name Sarus is attached to treachery, betrayal, and clandestine stabbings, which I find fascinating. It's like these legends are just this weird telephone game.
Well, yeah, you said it earlier, right? These legends and the people who sang these legends or told these legends, they were getting them garbled. And some people would tell the legend one way, and some people would tell the legend another way. And it's why it's really important that folklorists go and look into how and why we have all these different versions, and where the breakdown in the story might tell us something else about the people who were telling the story. I love it.
But it's Ermanaric and Sunilda who figure in Germanic legend most prominently. Ermanaric appears in Norse sagas as Eor Menric, in Beowulf as a king of, quote, wiles and hatred. In the Old English poem Deor, he's mentioned as Eor Monric, cruel and with a, quote, wolfish mind. In the legends of Dietrich von Bern, Ermanaric or Ermenric is Dietrich's evil uncle, usually a main antagonist in these stories. While Ammianus Marcellinus' description of Ermanaric is mostly heroic, what's come down in legend appears to be fairly negative, and much of it seems to be rooted in this story in Jordanes about Sunilda. That story has been told and retold in a number of Norse poems and sagas, the Prose Edda, the Danish Gesta Danorum, and the Nibelungenlied of Germany. I'm sorry, I don't speak German. I don't know how to say that. Of Germany, among others. There are many different versions of the tale, but in many of them, Sunilda, this is kind of the most basic version, Sunilda, who we know almost nothing about, is transformed into Svanhildr, the most beautiful woman in the world and the daughter of the legendary Germanic hero Sigurd. Svanhildr marries Ermanaric, who suspects her of sleeping with his son. Maddened by jealousy, Ermanaric orders Svanhildr trampled to death beneath his horse's hooves. In revenge, Svanhildr's mother encourages her 2, sometimes 3, sons, Svanhildr's half-brothers, to gain revenge, usually by killing Ermanaric. Sometimes they just cut off his hands or something.
I mean, that is wild, but also so interesting about the father's fear of, I guess, his son fucking his mother. That's a real interesting, thing to unpack.
His stepmother.
Sorry. I apologize. His stepmother. We see that in a few places, and we've seen it already in Greek mythology. You see it in a lot of places, and I think there is something here about maybe fear of aging, fear of your son coming to take your place, and in particular, as this is his stepmother, maybe she's significantly younger.
I feel like that fear absolutely crops up in Greek mythology. You have son castrates father, it's like a family tradition. It's very obvious that the fathers are terrified of being usurped by the sons, eclipsed in virility and things like that. That seems to be a very seminal fear of your basic ancient world man. I don't know if modern men have a similar fear. I have never heard of this, but potentially.
What's interesting to me here is that this is the most beautiful woman, and it's of course, she would be fucking her stepson and her husband. And I feel like there's so much blame attached to women, particularly women who are viewed as beautiful, which is a lens that men are viewing them through. Their own desire.
That's usually the most important characteristic of any woman in mythology is she beautiful? That's the gatekeep for if she gets to be in a story or not.
It truly is. We wrote a book about it, Women of Myth.
Unless she's a monster, in which case she's probably hideous. Unless she's beautiful and her whole thing is seducing men.
So another important hero who appears in lots of Germanic legends is Dietrich von Bern. Dietrich von Bern was a mythologized version of Theodoric the Great. The theory is that Dietrich, which means ruler of the people, is a German translation of Theodoric's name in Gothic, which meant the same thing. There are many, many different stories about Dietrich von Bern. The general gist is that Dietrich is a king who rules in Italy. His capital city is Verona, a 3-hour car ride or so northwest of Ravenna. His evil uncle, Ermenric, or Ermanaric, drives him out, and he's forced to go into exile in the court of Etzel, king of the Huns, or Attila.
That's Attila the Hun. They call him Etzel in a lot of these legends.
Eventually, he returns to Italy and reclaims his kingdom with the help of Etzel's army. So that's the basic story, and there are many variations, and you can track the similarities and differences between that and Theodoric's life.
I just find this so fascinating, what gets preserved in the myth and what is this telephone game that gets played. So first, the differences. Obviously, Theodoric the Great never met Attila the Hun or Ermanaric in real life. They were both dead before he was born. Second, Theodoric was never, I guess, maybe this is arguable, was he really ever the rightful king of Italy? He didn't have this sort of long history of his family ruling Italy when he came in and took over, and he wasn't even Caesar on paper, I guess he would have been, of the Western Roman Empire. He was supposed to be working for the Eastern Roman Emperor, but he just did his own thing and basically established his own kingdom. That's kind of what his story was.
Pretty boss.
Well, sure, but he wasn't the rightful king who should have inherited it because his dad was king.
I mean, so many emperors did not inherit because their dad was emperor. They just killed their way into it.
There's a whole different sideline we could take arguing about what constitutes a rightful king.
I think the fun thing about Rome is they're all usurpers of democracy, which is great.
Fact. Also, Dietrich's capital city is depicted as Verona, not Ravenna. Verona is also in northern Italy, about a 3-hour drive away, as we said. Some historians believe that's a clue that these stories originated with the Lombards, the Germanic group that wrested Italy from the Byzantines after Justinian I took it back from the Ostrogoths in the later 500s, 560s or something, I forget. For a time, their capital city was Verona. And there's a recurring character in these stories named Hildebrand, Dietrich's tutor. That name is also Lombardic, another clue. Some have said that means this story's origin could date from approximately 558 to 774 AD, which I believe was how long the Lombards were in control of Italy.
This is Jen.
And Jenny.
From Ancient History Fangirl, and we're here to tell you about my co-host Jenny's scorching historical romantasy, Enemy of My Dreams.
In the last days of the Roman Empire, a desperate princess and a brutal Gothic warlord forge a dangerous alliance. Julia, only daughter of the Emperor of Rome, lives a life of excess and freedom. But when her father dies and her teenage brother takes the throne, he will stop at nothing to seize control of both the empire and his wayward sister. And now, Alaric of the Visigoths, a ferocious warrior who has battled Rome for years, has come to the capital to bargain for his homeland.
Realizing how perilous her position is, Julia impulsively turns to Alaric, the empire's sworn enemy and the one man who can make Rome tremble, in an edgy, sexy, cat-and-mouse game of attraction, defiance, and lust.
Best-selling author Elodie Harper says, quote, "This is a hugely entertaining Roman world romantasy with a hilarious heroine and smoldering hero whose adventures in love and war are set against the backdrop of the last dangerous days of an ancient empire. Enemy of My Dreams is available wherever books are sold."
Is there a baby in your life who's about to start solid foods? This can be such a confusing and stressful time. As a mom of 7, I really struggled with spoon feeding my oldest baby. But once I realized that babies can safely feed themselves real, wholesome foods using the principles of baby-led weaning, feeding the rest of my babies became an actually enjoyable experience instead of something that I used to dread. Hi, I'm Katie Ferraro, college nutrition professor and dietitian specializing in baby-led weaning, and I host the Baby-Led Weaning Made Easy podcast. Each week, we cover evidence-based, safe infant feeding practices for parents and caregivers of babies who are 6 to 12 months of age. So, if you're confused by all the conflicting info you hear about starting solid foods, or you want easy, actionable tips on how to safely prep food for your baby, or introduce allergenic foods, or figure out when to drop a milk feed, we cover all that and more, plus interviews with the world's leading feeding experts in 2 new episodes each week. Search Baby-Led Weaning wherever you listen to podcasts, and happy feeding.
Throughout history, royals across the world were notorious for incest. They married their own relatives in order to consolidate power and keep their blood blue. But they were oblivious to the havoc all this inbreeding was having on the health of their offspring. From Egyptian pharaohs marrying their own sisters to the Habsburgs' notoriously oversized lower jaws. I explore the most shocking incestuous relationships and tragically inbred individuals in royal history. And that's just episode 1. On the History Tea Time podcast, I profile remarkable queens and LGBTQ+ royals, explore royal family trees, and delve into women's medical history and other fascinating topics. I'm Lindsay Holiday, and I'm spilling the tea on history. Join me every Tuesday for new episodes of the History Tea Time podcast, wherever fine podcasts are enjoyed.
Hello everyone, Stakuyi here.
And I'm Gabby.
And we are the hosts of History of Everything, a podcast which you can probably guess by the name is, well, I mean, it's about everything. Do you want to know why people thought potatoes were evil and would give you syphilis? Are you curious about all the stories of the terrible and stupid ways that people have kicked the bucket over the years? Do you want to hear tales about all of the different badasses of history and the lives that they had brought to life? Well, if so, then look no further. History of Everything is just the right podcast for you. It's available on Spotify, Pandora, and anywhere else that you get your podcast from. Join us for some fun and just see how weird and wacky history can be.
But there are some similarities to Theodoric's life too. For instance, Theodoric's group of Goths did come from the court of Attila to take over Italy.
I mean, quote unquote court. Did the Huns have a court in the way that we're imagining it? I'm not really sure.
I hope so. But also, I hope 2/3 of the things I imagine are true. There's unicorns out there.
Yeah, like I feel like when Attila is described, it's kind of like Etzel as like a typical sort of later king with a castle and and that's not really how they operated. Sometimes he's jousting, like...
I don't think they even invented jousting yet.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, he's kind of depicted, not always, but frequently depicted as like, most of these guys as like more modern sort of medieval knights in a way that would not have been true.
So Theodoric did have Huns in his army, so associating him with Huns is accurate. Also, like Theodoric, Dietrich had an heir problem, and his nearest and dearest repeatedly die in his attempt to reconquer Italy, and echo back to the brief and tumultuous rule of the Ostrogoths in Italy, and the war they had to fight against Odoacer. These connections are all pretty tenuous, though. Literature that features Dietrich or Theodoric include...
This one's my favorite. It's a massive standing stone in Sweden with the longest known runic inscription ever written in stone. And it's the oldest known piece of writing in Swedish, dating from around 800 AD. It mentions Theodoric and the Ostrogoths by name. I think that's so cool. So the translation I've seen goes like this. Quote, Theodoric the Bold, king of sea warriors, ruled over reed sea shores. Now he sits armed on his Gothic horse, shield strapped, prince of the Marings. And the Marings, this is a word I've seen in other epics too. I've seen historians say that this probably refers to Theodoric's people or his family line. It's hard to tell. But this inscription may be referring to an iconic statue of Theodoric that once stood in Ravenna. It depicted him on a horse with his shield hanging over his left shoulder, holding a lance in his right hand. I don't think he was jousting. I think it was more like a spear. Everyone would have known that statue. In 801 AD, maybe around when this stone was made, Charlemagne moved it to Aachen, Germany. The statue, not the stone. He moved the statue of Theodoric to Aachen, Germany.
The next one is the Hildebrand Slide. And this is a poem in Old High German written in the 830s AD. This is a fascinating poem with a wild history, which maybe I can twist Jenny's arm into going into further on a Patreon episode, where two warriors meet on a battlefield and fight. And it turns out that they're father and son. It probably ends with the father killing the son, as in Cuchulain's story, but the poem breaks off before you find out. The salient point is that the son, Hildebrand, claims his father was a servant of Dietrich von Bern, who fled east to escape the wrath of another recognizable name, Odoacer. Odoacer was the Germanic usurper that the real Theodoric fought and deposed to gain control of Italy.
You also see Dietrich von Bern in Old English poems like Widsith, Deor, and Waldir. I'm sure I've mispronounced all of that. These are fragmentary poems all dating to the late 900s or so. In them, Theodoric is mentioned by name and sometimes Ermanaric by name, and only briefly. Deor is where we get that description of Ermanaric as having a wolf-like mind, by the way. It's a really vivid description. Here's a quote from the Widsith, translated by Christopher Tolkien, who was either J.R.R. Tolkien's son or grandson. I actually forget. I'm sorry. Anyway, quote, Wolf here I sought, and worm here. I know I'm mispronouncing all of that. Seldom was warfare stilled, and when the host of the Heredas about the Vistula forest had to defend with their swords their ancient dwelling place from the peoples of Attila, Tolkien tells us Heredas meant God.
So the next place we see this is the Norse Thidric saga, dating from roughly 1250 AD. It's in Old Norse, but it's a collection of continental Germanic legends, including that of Dietrich, In the story, we get the general plot of Theodoric being driven out of his kingdom by his evil uncle, Ermenric, and washing up in the court of Attila the Hun, and eventually winning back his kingdom. Interesting plot point, after many adventures, including slaying a dragon and later becoming king of the Huns after Attila's death, Dietrich takes up hunting. One day, after seeing a particularly impressive specimen of deer, he leaps out of his bathtub, I don't know why he's hunting in the bathtub, and jumps onto a massive black horse, which is actually the devil in disguise. Ha ha ha. The devil gallops off with Dietrich, and nobody knows what becomes of him after.
How awesome is that? Like, it's all about Theodoric's death.
Yeah, and this has some echoes of the stories about demonic horses carrying Theodoric off after, around his death time, right? Theodoric was also buried in a bathtub. It's really fascinating. I mean, the devil and black horses and all that. My Irish-Scottish bones are like, demonic horses that carry you off to your death or to hell? Yes, please. I get that story. I know that story.
I don't think that particular story about Theodoric's death is Irish.
But I think there is something to ancient horses and how easily they did carry people off to their death, whether through riding accidents or wars or anything else, and you are never seen again. I can see why that crops up in different places, regardless of whether or not it's related to a certain area's mythology.
Well, horses were dangerous, like you also have a lot of examples of people getting trampled by horses or torn apart by horses and things like that. So there is similarities in terms of people's experience, I guess.
Yeah. And just in general, people who got onto the back of a horse might never return. And you wouldn't know what happened to them. It could be because you went to war. It could be because you got thrown from the horse and nobody found your body, or you were set upon by brigands or whatever. Like, horses were dangerous. And I love it. And beautiful and wonderful. And this is not like anything negative about horses.
No, we're not blaming the horse. Unless the horse is specifically the devil, but even then. It's like the idea of like the sea being a cruel mistress. It's like, yeah, well, they had all these stories about the sea because a lot of people didn't come back when they went out to sea. So the Poetic Edda, written in Icelandic around 1270 AD, has Dietrich or Theodrek appearing as an exile in the court of Attila the Hun. Although it's an iconic Icelandic poem, there is a lot of Germanic influence here. We have an Attila the Hun, the names of various characters that appear more or less identical to their names in Germanic epics, and a woman even has to undergo the ordeal of hot water, which was originally codified in Visigothic law.
Do you want to tell us what that was? Because people won't remember it.
Well, we didn't actually talk about it. I was going to put it in our Visigoths episode, but I wound up running out of room, so it might wind up in a Patreon. So the ordeal of hot water, I think there are different versions of it, but if you were accused of a crime, you had to plunge your arm into a boiling pot of water. And then you had to hold it there, and then, it would be bandaged up, and in a few days, they would check your bandages. And if the wound was all festery and gross and not healing well, you would be found guilty. And if it was healing well, you would be found innocent. That is the ordeal of hot water.
That is wild. That's really fucking wild.
Isn't that messed up?
It's so messed up, and I'm really glad you told us because I didn't know.
Yeah, the ordeal of hot water was codified in Visigothic law. This is a thing that might happen to you if someone accuses you of a crime. Great times. I feel like it also appears in other places, but this might be the earliest. I could be wrong. Anyway, so there are a whole lot of other places where Dietrich von Bern appears in various epics and stories in Denmark, the Faroe Islands, Sweden, and many other places. Sometimes Dietrich has cameos in other Germanic legends.
In addition to semi-historical events, Dietrich's adventures sometimes include fighting mythical creatures such as dragons, giants, and dwarfs. He also fights other Germanic heroes that play a lead role in other epics. Siegfried, for instance. At one point, in some stories, he develops the ability to breathe fire. These stories are wild. Sometimes there are accompanying illustrations, such as Theodoric jousting with Odoacer. Attila the Hun gets to joust in one version too, just, we didn't leave him out.
Right, we don't want him to feel left out.
Never.
I think this is so funny that there's one epic where he gets the ability to breathe fire, which kind of goes against the idea that the Germanic hero is always an exceptionally talented person, but no magical skills or no demigod skills. Like, that is obviously not always true. And a lot of these things that are qualities of Germanic heroes or whatever, not always true.
Well, there's got to be an exception to a rule, right? So, one potential influence on the development of the Dietrich von Bern mythologies could have their roots in defying or denying Arianism. Again, this is Arianism is an Arianism Christianity with an I. Remember, Theodoric was hated by the Orthodox Christians when he died, but in general, Dietrich is presented in a much more positive light than Theodoric was at the end of his life. So that makes us wonder if it was outsiders, the Lombards, who mythologized him this way.
Right, because they didn't know about all the ways he had pissed people off while he was actually ruling, right? They just got sort of legends about how strong and great a king he was.
Yeah, it's your telephone game. This is the bits of the telephone game that they chose to, or that came down to them. So they're like, this is how we mythologize him.
Yeah, whereas Ermanaric might have originally been a very heroic self-sacrificing type, hard to say, but weirdly what comes down to us is this sort of story about treachery and killing this woman, Svanhildur or Sunilda, and being torn apart by horses. Isn't that weird? It's where does this come from? I mean, we know it comes from Jordanes, but it's where did Jordanes get it?
I mean, Jordane's gonna Jordane.
Yeah, that's really true. And if you read Jordanes, there are a lot of games of telephone that he plays. For example, with that name Saris, with legends and tales that are potentially only 150 years old.
No one hates history, they just haven't found the right teacher yet. Or in this case, a nerdy best friend who loves to tell you all about world history, women's history, and weird history. Hi, I'm TK, the creator of For the Love of History podcast, a place for people who want to learn more but don't know where to start, and history lovers who want to break from the mainstream. From rat trials to warrior women, we cover topics from every country and era. Whether you're a history expert or just starting out, there's a place for you here in the Time Machine. So join me every Friday on your favorite podcast platform and YouTube for a brand new topic. See you there. Bye.
So, you may have noticed that so far I've only mentioned Ostrogothic heroes that made it into Germanic legend, but what about Visigothic heroes? There's at least one, and it's Walter of Aquitaine. Walter of Aquitaine appears in a number of Germanic epics, sometimes alongside Dietrich von Bern. The oldest is Waldir from the late 900s AD. In his most complete epic, Waltharius, written in the 1000s AD, Walter's father rules Aquitaine, as the Visigoths did in the 400s or 500s AD. Eventually, Attila invades, like in the Battle of Shalong, and Walter winds up a hostage at Attila the Hun's court and fights at the head of Attila's army. So they're definitely getting their Visigoths and Ostrogoths confused here. But eventually he escapes with his betrothed during a drunken feast and gets caught up in a series of heroic duels on his way back to reclaim his kingdom. There's a lot of reclaiming kingdoms here, and I think that that's kind of an older Gothic meme, I suppose you could say, about the Goths looking for a homeland.
Yeah, I mean, it's an attractive legend, right?
Yeah, and it's something that is kind of hacked from the history in a way.
So this story is fragmentary and a bit chaotic, just like all things Goth related, I feel like. But what's interesting here is that it includes aspects of both Visigothic and Ostrogothic history. Attila the Hun really did invade the Visigothic kingdom in 451 AD during the Battle of Shalon. During that time, Ostrogothic chieftains fought at the head of his army, while Visigothic leaders fought against him. And earlier, the Ostrogoths could be said to have been, quote-unquote, hostages at Attila court and, quote-unquote, escaped upon his death, which was at a drunken feast. So, this myth tells a version of the truth.
Isn't that wild? So, I want to talk about the turfing cycle. I may have mispronounced that. Apologies if I did. I've mentioned the turfing cycle already in the episode about Gothic pre-Christian religion. This poem dates from the 1200s AD in Iceland, and there are lots of connections to the Goths here, including the connection between turfing, the name of the cursed sword in the cycle, and the Turvingi, the ancient tribal name of Alaric's Goths. Again, in this story, we have a magical cursed sword, double-edged like a Turvingi oath, but there's also a whole chapter called The Battle of the Goths and the Huns. Isn't that wild? I think that's wild. We don't know if this story refers to a real battle or not. Historians have argued about this forever. Christopher Tolkien, in his translation, says, quote, "It is extremely probable that there was once a continuous narrative and dialogue poem on the Gotho-Hunnic War, independent of its present context, needing no saga to explain it." And what I think that means is that there could have been a much older tradition about some war between Goths and Huns, which may have been the Battle of Shalon, or it may have been something else, that everybody would have known at the time, so they didn't really need context. They would just know what this is about. But as time wore on, it became garbled.
So, The Battle of the Goths and the Huns is an interesting document because some scholars believe it is perhaps the oldest Norse poem ever written down. This is mainly due to some linguistic characteristics. Christopher Tolkien says, quote, "Evidence suggests that some parts, at least of it, are very ancient, is to be seen in its metrical form in certain uses of words, in which an earlier pre-Norse layer of language has been discerned, and in the substance of the poem itself." The general story is that King Heidrekr, king of the Goths, has two sons, Angentir and Hlod. Hlod is illegitimate. His mother was the daughter of the king of the Huns, and he is raised in the Hunnic court.
Angentir is legitimate, and he's in line for King Heidrekr's throne. Heidrekr possesses the cursed sword Turfing, and one day some slaves kill him and steal it. Angentir, his son, his legitimate son, vows never to rest on his father's throne until he finds it. One day, while walking on a beach, he comes upon some fishermen and sees one of them behead a fish using his father's sword. He kills them and recovers it. Not long after, his brother, Hlod, turns up and demands half his kingdom as his rightful inheritance. Angantyr welcomes Hlod as a long-lost brother, offers him vast wealth, but refuses his kingdom. It's like, no, that's going a little too far, okay? Hlod departs and gathers an army of Huns, with which he returns to fight a great battle for his father's throne against his brother. And this is so, like, all these stories have to do with, like, invading a kingdom that is rightfully yours with a bunch of Huns at your back and winning it. Like, this is such a huge trope. Anyway, that doesn't work out that way in this story because Hlod eventually loses. But the plains of Angantyr's kingdom run red with blood and the rivers are choked with corpses. Tolkien, it's said, may have based his Rohirrim on Angantyr's Goths. Isn't that wild?
I love it.
I figured you would like this part.
Yeah. So here are the words Angantyr speaks over his brother's corpse after he kills him with turfing. "Treasures uncounted, kinsmen I offered thee, wealth and cattle, well to content thee. But for wars rewarding, thou hast won neither new boundaries nor bright arm rings. A curse was on us, brother. Thy bane have I wrought thee. 'Twill be never forgotten. The gnome's doom is evil."
Throughout this story, Angantyr's people are referred to as Goths, and Hlod's are Huns. There seems to be a real through line here in terms of legends about Goths winding up in the court of the Huns, either as refugees or as hostages, and returning with a Hunnic army at their back to take back a kingdom. Again, we see this happening a lot in the Dietrich von Bern stories as well, but it also happens in the Walter of Aquitaine stories. This idea of what the Ostrogoths went through has been bled into the myths. Christopher Tolkien makes the argument that the poem preserves a number of ancient place names that may be endemic to Gothic and that are preserved nowhere else, and that this poem may be the closest we can get to hearing the type of poems and stories told in Gothic longhouses and around fires in their wagon loggers and stuff. Some have argued it might date back to the Battle of Chalon or the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, which took place in 451 AD, as I've said, although there isn't much in the poem to suggest this, and others believe it might point back to a battle that took place in the north of the Danube in Ermenaric's time, or a few years later. We really don't know.
Tolkien believes there must be a connection between this poem and the Widsith, which mentions the Goths defending their homeland from the Huns. In the original Anglo-Saxon, there are several proper and place names in common which appear nowhere else. That poem dates from the early 900s. And if that's the case, it suggests that this story must have been widespread enough to be known in both Icelandic and in Anglo-Saxon. So that's a general overview of Germanic legend and how stories of the Goths in the Migration era and the Visigothic and Ostrogothic kingdoms lived on. There is one story about a female warrior, but Jenny has saved it for the Patreon.
It's a long rabbit hole, and I am going to tell it on the Patreon.
So, in some ways, the Goths are very much with us still today in the fantasy genre. You can see echoes of them in the fantasy genre, particularly with the work that Tolkien did. That work has its roots in Gothic legends and the myths of the Migration era. So the next time you watch Lord of the Rings or read a fantasy book, keep that in your brain.
But what about other things we call Gothic? Things like art, literature, architecture, music, and fashion. Does that have any connection to the Goths of the Migration era and the Great Gothic Kingdoms? That's really debatable. And in our next episode, we're going to debate that. So that's it for this week. We'll be back in 2 weeks. In the meantime, come find us on all the socials. We're at Ancient History Fangirl, most active on Instagram, updates only on X, And you can join our Patreon at patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl. We do have one patron to thank, and I'm really sorry, I'm probably going to mispronounce this name, but I'm going to try my best not to. Yamekye K. Highmore. I'm so sorry, I hope I did not mess that up. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, and we will see you in 2 weeks.
Hey everyone, it's Jen and Jenny here. And we've got a bonus treat for you. We're giving you an excerpt from the audiobook version of Jenny's novel, Enemy of My Dreams, narrated by the fantastic Lisa Flanagan.
So this is a spicy scene, just a heads up. I am dropping exactly one spicy scene in our rotating cast of excerpts from the audiobook, and I love this one because Julia and Alaric's relationship gets sexy without losing that fun antagonism.
That's the joy of enemies to lovers, and this book is definitely enemies to lovers.
They definitely act like mature adults here. I don't know. I love it because these people are clearly obsessed with each other and fighting it, and that's really fun for me. And again, Lisa Flanagan's narration just really brings all this to life, and I just love it so much and felt the need to share it with all of you.
Give this a listen. We hope you enjoy it. And you can pick up the audiobook or a physical copy or an ebook of Enemy of My Dreams wherever books are sold.
Julia paced the guest house furious. Hours had passed, day had faded, and the twins would not let her out. Alaric had put the fear in them. How dare he imprison her here like a dog that had slipped its leash? The message could not be clearer. She was a prisoner, and she must never forget it. At least there was wine. Julia poured herself another cup of the robust red, just as voices rose outside and then the shadows shifted. She turned to see Alaric, framed by the sunset, lifting the door flap, with one superbly muscled arm. "Where have you been?" she demanded. By way of reply, he crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, silencing her disapproval with his mouth. He crushed her to him, his kiss hot and demanding, and suddenly she'd forgotten her anger entirely. "I'm sorry," he murmured against her throat. "I'd have come earlier if I could." But she no longer cared. She was on fire, melting in his arms, defenseless as he lifted her onto the table. Her legs came up of their own accord, locking around his hips. He pressed her onto her back, his mouth burning a ferocious line to her collarbone. Her hands curled into his hair. "Don't. Stop." But she was shaking with need, and from the wicked laugh in her ear she knew what he had heard. "Don't stop." She felt like a candle wick lit aflame. He brought his mouth back up to her lips, kissing her long and deep, and Julia forgot everything else. This was Alaric, fire and war and savagery racing through her blood like fever. It had been so goddamn long. He'd come to her warm from another woman's bed. The thought was cold water on her desire. Dimly she realized he had her up on the table now, her legs thrown wildly around his waist, her skirt hiked up her thighs, her whole body arching up to him, as if making an offering of herself. So much for being the one he couldn't have. "Stop! We have—" Her body throbbed and ached and hurt. "We have to talk." It surprised her to no end when he backed off. Julia slid off the table, turning her back to him as she adjusted her clothes, then busied herself pouring a cup of wine. Her hands shook. At her back, an intense, ferocious quiet. She gulped the wine, and when she turned, he was leaning casually against the central pole that held up the roof. Chiseled arms crossed over his magnificently bare chest. When had he lost his shirt? "Well?" He raised a brow. "Talk." Julia drew a breath. For a moment she could not remember words. "If you won't, then I will." Blue eyes glittered in the light from the banked coals. "I will not send you back to your brother. Stay with me, Julia." Julia covered her shock by taking another drawn-out sip of her wine. What was she to make of this? Was he offering Rome in exchange? Had he come from Brisca's bed to say that? Be the one he can't have. "You have nerve," she said lightly. You assume a great deal. Just because I lay with you once doesn't mean I will again." His eyes dropped significantly to her shaking hands. "Is that so?" Julia tensed. She wished he wouldn't drop his voice to a throaty purr like that. It was entirely unfair, when all he had to do was look at her to make her absolutely stupid with the desire to touch him. The gods help her when he grinned or crossed his arms over his chest or took his shirt off. "Are you prepared to pay my price, King of the Goths?" Julia arched a brow. "You gave Briska a kingdom for her time in your bed. I want an empire." Alaric's laugh rolled through her, warm and luxurious. Julia's hands clenched around her cup. Would she win this negotiation by throwing it at him? Cleopatra would never. "Julia, not 3 weeks ago you were a vagabond who begged me to take you. You have nothing to offer. No kingdom, no allies, no land. And you think you have the standing to demand an empire of me? For something I can have from any willing woman." His grin flashed on his tanned face. "You're the one with nerve." Rage stopped her breath. "Laugh at me all you wish, but if you want a place in my bed, an empire is my price." "So transactional, Julia." He said it softly. Hairs rose on her arms. "No." "No." Why did it hurt so much? What did Briska have that she did not? "I suppose you don't wish to share my bed after all." "That is not what I said." He was coming toward her now, a dangerous stillness about him even when in motion. He stopped before her, planting his hands on either side of her on the table, boxing her in. "Correct me if I'm wrong," he said quietly. "But it's been my impression that you want this as much as I do." A hot, insistent throb began between her thighs. Julia felt herself lean forward, almost meeting him, close enough to kiss. Their breaths mingled, heated the air. She had the distinct feeling he was waiting for her to cross the final distance between them. To admit he was right. In her mind, she slid her hands up the corded strength of his arms, then greedily over his chest, feeling the hard ridges of muscle on his stomach, and the lines of his scars beneath her palms. In her mind, she ran her tongue along the seam of his lips, just a finger's length from her, pressed her mouth to the strong column of his throat, licked the scent of him off his skin. Oh, gods, she wanted to. The thought of him holding himself still like that fierce, disciplined stillness while she touched and licked him everywhere, made her weak with desire. Of course, she could never admit to the debilitating power he held over her. That would be a terrible mistake. "I don't want you." What a lie. She wanted to rub herself against him like a cat in heat. "I want to rule Rome in my brother's stead." More lies. She was lying through her teeth to a man who looked at her as if he could see down to the bottom of every lie she'd ever told. "If that is how you want it, I will not come to you again. In fact, I'm willing to predict it is you who will come to me." A mocking grin lifted his lips. "I'll take you then, but only when you beg." "I'll never do that. In fact, I rather think it's you who'll beg before this week is out." His laugh sounded against her throat. The sweet, warm vibration of it made her toes curl. "We'll see who breaks first, then." And then, to her vast annoyance, he was gone.